The phone buzzed face down on the kitchen counter, and Laura's hand froze halfway to picking it up. Daniel had never once turned his phone face down before, not in 8 years of marriage, not when he was tired, not when he was busy, not even when his mother called at midnight to complain about her knees. Something had changed, and Laura felt it in her chest before she could put it into words. She poured the coffee anyway, set 2 cups on the table, and waited for him to come downstairs. When he did, freshly showered and already dressed for work, he smiled at her the way he always did, kissed her forehead, and picked up his phone without looking at the screen. He slipped it straight into his pocket. "Big day?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "Same as always," he said. "Meetings all morning." He left 12 minutes earlier than usual. Laura stood at the window and watched his car back out of the driveway, turn left instead of right, and disappear down a street that led nowhere near his office. She told herself it was nothing. People took different routes for all kinds of reasons. Maybe there was construction. Maybe he needed gas. She had built a life with this man, raised 2 children with him, trusted him with every part of herself. A wrong turn was not evidence of anything. But that evening, when she went to pay the credit card bill, she found a charge she could not explain. A hotel, 2 towns over, $180, dated 3 days earlier. Daniel had told her he was working late that night. She remembered because she had kept his dinner warm in the oven until nearly 10 o'clock. Laura sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the screen. The house was quiet. Their son and daughter were already asleep upstairs, worn out from soccer practice and homework. She could hear the refrigerator humming, the tick of the clock above the stove, and underneath all of it, the sound of her own heartbeat, faster than it should have been. She did not confront him that night. She told herself she needed more information first, that jumping to conclusions would only make her look foolish if there was an innocent explanation. But even as she thought it, she did not believe it. 8 years of marriage had taught her the difference between Daniel's ordinary tiredness and this new, careful stillness that had settled over him in the past few weeks. It had started small. A late night here, a missed call there. He had begun taking his laptop into the garage to work instead of sitting with her in the living room like he used to. When she asked about his day, his answers had grown shorter, vaguer, as if he were reciting a script rather than remembering something that actually happened to him. 3 weeks earlier, she had noticed he'd started locking his phone with a new code, one he had never used before. When she picked it up by habit to check the weather, the screen had stayed dark and unfamiliar in her hand, refusing her thumbprint for the first time in years. She had asked him about it, casually, while they were making dinner. "New code, huh?" "Work thing," he'd said, not looking up from the onions he was chopping. "New security policy. Everyone has to change it." She had let it go. Now, sitting alone with the credit card statement glowing on her laptop screen, she wished she had pushed harder. The next morning, Laura packed her children's lunches, drove them to school, and then sat in the parking lot of a coffee shop instead of going home. She needed to think. She needed to decide what kind of wife she was going to be about this. The kind who waited quietly and hoped it would resolve itself, or the kind who found out the truth, whatever it cost her. She thought about her sister, Claire, who had gone through something similar 2 years earlier. Claire's husband had been unfaithful for nearly a year before she found out, and by the time she did, everyone at his office already knew. Claire had told her once that the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was realizing how much of her life she had spent not seeing what was right in front of her. Laura was not going to let that happen to her. She called Claire from the parking lot. "I think Daniel is lying to me about something," she said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. Claire was quiet for a moment. "What kind of lying?" "I don't know yet. A hotel charge, a new phone code. He's taking different routes to work." Laura pressed her fingers against her temple. "It sounds so small when I say it out loud." "It never sounds small to the person living it," Claire said. "Trust your gut, Laura. It's usually right, even when you wish it wasn't." They talked for almost an hour. Claire did not tell her what to do, but she listened, and by the end of the call, Laura felt a strange kind of clarity settle over her. She was not going to ask Daniel directly. Not yet. If something was wrong, she needed proof before she gave him the chance to explain it away with another smooth, convincing lie. That afternoon, she went through his desk drawer in the home office, the one he rarely used because he preferred the garage. Most of it was ordinary, old receipts, a stapler, a stack of business cards from people she didn't recognize. But tucked beneath a folder of tax documents, she found a small key, the kind that opened a safety deposit box or a storage locker. It did not match any lock in their house. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. She had lived in this house for 6 years. She knew every lock, every drawer, every hiding place her children had ever used for candy or toys. This key belonged to something she had never seen. She put it back exactly where she found it, and closed the drawer. That night she watched Daniel more closely than she ever had before. She noticed the way his eyes moved to his phone every few minutes, the way he excused himself twice during dinner to take calls he described only as work stuff, the way he flinched, just slightly, when their son asked him what he'd done at the office that day. Same old, Daniel said, ruffling their son's hair. Boring meetings, boring numbers. Laura smiled along with the rest of the table, but inside, something had shifted permanently. She no longer believed a single word he said about his days, and once that belief broke, she realized it did not come back easily. After the children were in bed, she lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, while her own mind raced through everything she had seen. The hotel charge, the new phone code, the changed route to work, the mysterious key. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they formed a shape she did not want to look at directly, but could not stop seeing out of the corner of her eye. She thought about the woman it might be. Someone from his office, maybe. Someone younger. Someone who laughed at his jokes the way Laura used to before life got busy and tired, and full of school pickups and grocery lists. She imagined confronting him. Imagined the words she would use. Imagined the specific kind of pain that came with hearing your husband admit he had chosen someone else. Even for one night. Even for 1 hour in a hotel 2 towns over. She told herself she was preparing for the worst, so that nothing could surprise her. She had no idea how wrong she was. The next few days passed in a strange, careful rhythm. Laura went about her normal life, packing lunches, running errands, smiling at neighbors, while underneath it all, she was gathering pieces of a puzzle she did not yet understand. She began checking the mail before Daniel got home, looking for anything unfamiliar. She started paying closer attention to the mileage on his car, comparing it quietly to what a normal day at the office should require. On Thursday, she found a second phone. It was tucked into the inside pocket of a jacket Daniel rarely wore, one that had hung in the back of the closet since winter. It was an old model, cheap, the kind of phone people bought with cash and no contract. It was locked, and when she tried, none of the codes she knew for him worked. She stood in the closet for a long moment, holding a phone that did not belong to the man she thought she knew, in a house that suddenly felt less like her own than it had that morning. Laura made a decision then. She was done waiting for the truth to come to her. She was going to go find it herself, whatever it turned out to be, whatever it cost her to know it. She put the phone back exactly where she had found it, closed the closet door, and went downstairs to start dinner, as if nothing in her world had changed at all. But something had, and by the time she understood what it truly was, she would look back on this quiet, uncertain version of herself, and almost envy how simple her fears had been, back when she still believed the worst thing Daniel could be hiding was another woman. That night, after the kitchen was clean and the children's backpacks were ready for the morning, Laura sat on the edge of the bathtub with the door locked, turning the pieces over in her mind one more time. A hotel receipt, a new phone code, a key that fit nothing in the house, a second phone hidden in a jacket he never wore. Each detail on its own could belong to 100 different innocent stories. She had tried, for hours, to build one of those stories in her head, something simple and forgivable. Something that would let her walk back into their bedroom and sleep without this tightness behind her ribs. She could not find one that fit. Daniel had always been a careful man, precise about details, the kind of person who remembered exactly how his coffee should be made and noticed immediately if the furniture in a room had been moved an inch. That same carefulness now worked against him. A careless man might have left a phone unlocked, might have mentioned a name at dinner without thinking, might have let something slip in his sleep. Daniel left nothing to chance, and that frightened her more than any single piece of evidence could have on its own. Whatever this was, he had been building it slowly, deliberately, for longer than a few weeks. She thought back over the past year, searching for a beginning. Had it started after his father's health scare last spring, when Daniel had taken 3 unexplained days off work and come home unusually quiet? Or had it started even earlier, back when he first mentioned an old friend from college reaching out to reconnect? A name she had never heard before and never heard again. She had not thought much of either moment at the time. Now every memory felt like it might be hiding something underneath it, a second layer she had never bothered to check. Laura ran the water in the sink so the sound would cover the fact that she was crying, quietly, without any real reason she could name yet. She was not crying because she knew what he had done. She was crying because she no longer knew who he was, and that uncertainty felt heavier than any specific betrayal could have been. A person could survive an affair. People did it every day, rebuilt their marriages, found their way back to trust eventually, or found their way out and built something new. But this felt different. This felt like standing in a house she had lived in for years and suddenly not being sure the walls were where she remembered them. She dried her face, turned off the water, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Whatever she found, she decided, she would face it with clear eyes and a steady hand. She was not going to let fear make her decisions for her, not this time, not with so much at stake for her children as well as herself. When she finally climbed into bed, Daniel stirred slightly and murmured something about an early meeting before drifting back to sleep. Laura lay beside him in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and thought about how strange it was that a person could sleep so peacefully while holding a secret large enough to unravel someone else's entire world. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would start looking for real answers. Not guesses, not fears, not imagined scenarios built from a handful of suspicious details. She would follow the truth wherever it led, no matter how far it took her from the comfortable life she thought she had been living. She had no way of knowing yet just how far that would turn out to be, or how much the woman lying awake in that bed tonight would need to change before it was over. The storage unit key sat in Laura's coat pocket for 3 days before she worked up the courage to use it. She had taken it from the desk drawer on a Tuesday morning after Daniel left for work, slipping it into her palm the way a person might steal something precious from a museum, quick and quiet and full of guilt even though it belonged, in some sense, to the life they shared. She told herself she would put it back before he noticed. She told herself a lot of things that week that turned out not to be true. Finding the storage facility took longer than she expected. There were 4 within a 20-minute drive of their house, and she had no address, no unit number, nothing but a small brass key with a worn number stamped into its side. She visited the first 2 after dropping the children at school, walking in with a rehearsed story about her husband losing his paperwork, asking politely if they could check which unit matched her key. Both times, the answer was no, not without an account number or a name on file. At the 3rd facility, a squat building on the edge of town surrounded by chain-link fencing, the young man at the desk barely looked up from his phone before telling her the unit numbers matched a different key style entirely. Frustrated, she almost gave up. Then she remembered a storage company 2 towns over, the same town where the hotel from the credit card statement was located. It was not a coincidence she wanted to believe in, but she believed it anyway. The 4th facility was different from the others, newer, with keypad entry and rows of security cameras mounted along the fence line. Laura parked outside and sat in her car for several minutes, watching a woman load boxes into a unit near the entrance, an ordinary scene that made the whole search feel suddenly foolish. Maybe the key belonged to nothing important. Maybe she was building a mystery out of her own fear, the way Claire had warned her not to. But she got out of the car anyway. Inside, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, took one look at her key, and nodded slowly. "That's one of ours," he said. "Unit Block C. You'll need your account number though, ma'am. Can't just let anyone in with a key." "It's my husband's unit," Laura said, keeping her voice steady. "Daniel Bennett. I think I forgot the account number. I'm so sorry. We've had a hectic month. Could you look it up under his name?" The man typed for a moment, squinting at his screen. "Bennett. Yeah, here we go. Unit C14. You're listed as authorized on the account, so you're all set. Elevators around back." Laura had not known, until that moment, that she was listed as authorized on anything. It struck her as strange that Daniel would add her name to an account for a storage unit he had never once mentioned to her. Strange, and somehow reassuring, as if some small part of him had wanted her to be able to find this place eventually, even while the rest of him kept it hidden. Unit C14 was near the back of the building, at the end of a long, quiet hallway lit by humming fluorescent lights. Laura's hands shook as she turned the key in the lock. The door rolled up with a metallic groan that seemed far too loud in the empty corridor. Inside, the unit was smaller than she expected, no larger than a walk-in closet. There were no boxes of clothes, no old furniture, none of the ordinary things people stored when they ran out of space at home. Instead, there was a single metal filing cabinet, a duffel bag zipped shut in the corner, and a corkboard leaning against the wall, covered in photographs and handwritten notes connected by lengths of red string. Laura stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the corkboard. She recognized some of the photographs immediately. Daniel, younger, with a different haircut, standing beside people she had never seen before. A woman with sharp eyes and dark hair, cropped from a group photo. A man in an expensive suit photographed from a distance, as if the picture had been taken without his knowledge. Beneath each photograph, someone had written names, dates, and short phrases she did not understand. numbers that looked like account figures, a word, underlined twice, that made her stomach drop: debt. She approached the filing cabinet slowly, half expecting an alarm to sound, half expecting Daniel to appear behind her and demand to know what she was doing. The top drawer stuck slightly before sliding open, revealing neatly organized folders, each labeled with a name. None of the names were Daniel Bennett. One folder, thicker than the rest, was labeled simply with the letter V. Laura opened it with trembling hands. Inside were documents that looked like financial records, bank statements from accounts she had never seen, and beneath those, an identification card with Daniel's photograph on it and a completely different name printed beside it. Vincent Marsh, born the same year as Daniel, but in a city 3 states away from where she knew he had grown up. She sat down hard on the concrete floor of the storage unit, the folder still open in her lap, and tried to make sense of what she was looking at. It was not proof of an affair. There was no other woman here, no secret romance hidden among these files. What she had found instead was something she did not have a name for yet, something that made the ground beneath her marriage feel less solid than she had ever imagined. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she nearly screamed. It was only Claire, checking in the way she had promised to every few days since their first phone call. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, picking up on something in Laura's silence the moment she answered. "I don't think it's another woman," Laura whispered, still staring at the identification card in her hand. "Claire, I think it's something worse." She told her sister everything: the storage unit, the corkboard, the filing cabinet, the second identity with Daniel's face and a stranger's name. Claire was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "You need to leave that place right now," Claire finally said, her voice tight with a fear Laura had never heard in her before. "Take pictures of everything, but do it fast, and then go. If someone is watching that unit, you don't want to be the person standing in the middle of it when they show up." Laura had not considered that possibility until her sister said it aloud, and once she did, the quiet hallway outside the unit suddenly felt far less safe than it had a few minutes earlier. She used her phone to photograph the corkboard, the identification card, and several pages from the thickest folder, her hands moving quickly now, driven by something closer to instinct than courage. She returned everything to exactly where she had found it, careful to leave no sign that anyone had been inside, and pulled the door shut behind her. She did not remember most of the drive home. Her mind kept circling back to the name on that card: Vincent Marsh. Who was he? And what did it mean that Daniel had documents proving he could become this other person whenever he needed to? Had he always had this second identity, quietly waiting in a storage unit 2 towns away? Or was it something newer, something built recently in response to whatever trouble had followed him home? That evening, Laura went through the motions of ordinary life with a precision that frightened her. She made dinner, helped her daughter with a school project about the water cycle, listened to her son describe a goal he had scored in soccer practice, and smiled and nodded and asked the right questions at the right moments, all while a second version of herself sat quietly at the edge of everything, watching Daniel across the table, and wondering who exactly she had been sharing a bed with for the past 8 years. Daniel seemed more relaxed than he had in weeks. He laughed at something their son said, refilled Laura's water glass without being asked, and reached over at one point to squeeze her hand gently, the same small gesture of affection he had performed 1,000 times before. Laura let him. She even squeezed back, because the alternative, letting him see even a flicker of what she now knew, felt far too dangerous to risk before she understood the size of what she was dealing with. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet and Daniel had fallen asleep beside her, Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning the name Vincent Marsh over and over in her mind. She thought about the corkboard, the red string connecting faces she did not recognize, the word debt underlined twice in handwriting she was almost certain belonged to Daniel. She thought about her children sleeping down the hall, unaware that their father might be carrying a secret large enough to put all of them at risk. Whatever Daniel had done, whoever he had been before he became her husband, Laura understood now that this was no longer a story about a broken marriage. It was something far more dangerous, and she was only just beginning to understand how deep it went. By morning, she had made a decision. She was not going to confront him yet, not without understanding exactly what she was confronting. She needed to know who Vincent Marsh really was, why Daniel had built an entire second identity around him, and most importantly, whether the danger implied by that corkboard full of photographs and red string was something that had already found its way to their front door. Once the children were at school, Laura sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop and the photographs she had taken in the storage unit spread out in front of her, printed quietly at a copy shop across town where no one would recognize her. She began with the name Vincent Marsh returned almost nothing useful. A handful of unrelated people scattered across social media, none of them matching the face in the identification photo. Whoever had built that identity had been careful to keep it clean, free of the digital traces most people left behind without thinking. She tried the woman from the corkboard next, the one with sharp eyes and dark hair cropped from a larger photograph. It took nearly an hour of searching before Laura found a name that seemed to fit, attached to a small, blurry article from a regional newspaper archive. The article was several years old and described a business dispute involving unpaid loans and a company that had folded suddenly, leaving investors with significant losses. The woman's name appeared once, listed among several others as a person of interest. The reporter had been unable to reach for comment. Laura read the article 3 times, searching for any mention of Daniel or Vincent Marsh, and found none. But something about the language felt familiar, the careful, guarded tone reporters used when they suspected more than they could prove. She thought about the word debt underlined twice on the corkboard, and wondered if this old business dispute was where it had all started, years before she had ever met the man she now called her husband. She turned next to the man in the expensive suit, photographed from a distance as though the picture had been taken without his consent. Reverse image searching the photograph led her nowhere at first, page after page of unrelated results, until she narrowed her search using details from the folder she had photographed, a partial account number and a city name that appeared twice in the documents. Eventually, she found a name attached to a series of court filings from another state, records of a civil case that had been settled quietly, its details sealed from public view. The pattern forming in front of her was not the pattern of an affair, or even ordinary financial trouble. It looked, instead, like the outline of a much older story, one involving borrowed money, broken agreements, and people who did not forget when they were owed something. Laura closed her laptop and sat very still for a long moment, listening to the empty house around her, suddenly aware of how alone she was in a home she had always thought of as safe. She thought about calling the police, then hesitated, unsure what she would even say. She had no proof of any crime, only a hidden identity, some old newspaper clippings, and a growing sense of dread she could not fully explain to a stranger on the other end of a phone line. If she was wrong, she would tear her family apart over nothing. If she was right, and she called too soon, she might put all of them in danger before she understood what that danger actually was. Claire called again that afternoon, and this time Laura told her everything she had found that morning. The newspaper article, the sealed court case, the name Vincent Marsh that led nowhere at all. "This isn't a normal secret," Claire said quietly. "Laura, whatever Daniel is involved in, it sounds like it started a long time before you two even met." "I know," Laura said. "That's what scares me the most. If it's been following him this long, it isn't going to just go away because I finally noticed it." "Then you need to be smart about how you handle this," Claire said. "Don't let him know what you've found, not yet. Watch him. Learn as much as you can before you say anything. And Laura, please, be careful. If these people are dangerous enough that Daniel needed a second identity to hide from them, they're dangerous enough to hurt you too, without even meaning to." Laura promised she would be careful, though she was not entirely sure, hanging up the phone, what careful was even supposed to look like anymore. She spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the house with a kind of restless energy she could not otherwise release, scrubbing counters that were already clean, folding laundry that did not need folding. Anything to keep her hands busy while her mind worked through everything she had learned. That evening, when Daniel came home earlier than usual, cheerful and relaxed in a way that felt almost cruel given what she now knew, Laura found herself studying his face across the dinner table with new eyes. She looked for signs of the man in the storage unit photographs, the one connected by red string to unpaid debts and sealed court cases, and found only the familiar face she had loved for 8 years, smiling at their children, asking about their day, entirely unaware that his wife had begun quietly unraveling the life he had built to hide from something neither of them had ever spoken about. She decided that night that watching was not enough. If she wanted the whole truth, she would need to follow him, to see with her own eyes where he went, and who he met when he thought no one was paying attention. It was a decision that would change everything, though she did not yet know how far it would take her, or how close it would bring her to the very danger her sister had warned her about. Laura sat in her car across from Daniel's office building with the engine off, and her hands wrapped tightly around the steering wheel, watching the front doors for any sign of him. It was Friday evening, the same day of the week the hotel charge had appeared on their credit card statement, and she had spent the entire afternoon convincing herself this was not madness, that a wife had every right to know where her own husband went after work. She had told him she was taking the children to her sister's house for the weekend, a plan Claire had helped arrange on short notice, gathering their son and daughter for a sleepover with their cousins 2 hours away. Daniel had seemed relieved by the idea of a quiet weekend alone, and that relief had stung more than Laura expected, though she said nothing and simply kissed him goodbye that morning as if everything between them was ordinary. At 6:15, Daniel walked out of the building alone, loosening his tie as he crossed the parking lot to his car. Laura waited until he pulled out onto the main road before she followed, keeping several car lengths back the way she had seen people do in movies, hoping it would be enough to keep him from noticing her in his mirrors. He did not drive toward home. He drove east, out past the edge of town, along the same route that led to the hotel from the credit card statement. Laura's heart pounded harder with every mile, a strange mixture of dread and something close to relief, that she was finally about to learn something true, whatever that truth turned out to be. The hotel was a mid-range building set back from the road behind a row of pine trees, the kind of place designed to look unremarkable, easy to forget. Daniel parked near the back of the lot instead of near the entrance, and Laura pulled into a space several rows away, angling her car so she could watch him without being seen. He did not go inside right away. Instead, he stood beside his car for several minutes, checking his phone, glancing around the parking lot with a wariness that made Laura's stomach tighten. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, to see a woman step out to meet him, some confirmation of the fear she had carried since the very first hotel charge appeared. Instead, a dark sedan pulled into the lot and parked beside Daniel's car, and 2 men stepped out, both dressed in plain, unremarkable clothing that somehow still managed to look expensive. Laura recognized one of them immediately from the corkboard photographs in the storage unit, the man who had been photographed from a distance in an expensive suit. Up close, he moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, the kind of man used to being listened to. The second man stayed a step behind him, silent, his eyes scanning the parking lot the way Laura imagined a bodyguard might. She sank lower in her seat, her breath shallow, and watched as Daniel shook hands with the first man, a greeting that looked polite on the surface but carried an unmistakable tension underneath it, the kind of formality people used when neither side entirely trusted the other. The 3 men spoke for a few minutes in the open air of the parking lot before Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew a plain envelope, handing it across without ceremony. The man in the suit opened the envelope just enough to glance inside, nodded once, and slid it into his own jacket pocket. Whatever was inside, it seemed to satisfy him, at least for now. He said something to Daniel that Laura could not hear from this distance, something that made Daniel's shoulders tighten visibly even from across the parking lot. Then the 2 men returned to their car and drove away, leaving Daniel standing alone beside his vehicle, staring after them for a long moment before he finally got back into his own car and drove off in the opposite direction, back toward home. Laura did not follow him this time. She sat frozen in her car for several minutes after he disappeared from sight, replaying what she had just witnessed, trying to understand it in any terms that made sense. This was not the scene she had prepared herself for. There was no woman, no romantic betrayal she could grieve and eventually, perhaps, forgive. Instead, she had watched her husband hand an envelope of what she now felt certain was cash to a man connected to sealed court records and old newspaper articles about unpaid debts, in a hotel parking lot 2 towns from their home, on a night he had told her he would be working late. She drove home slowly, taking a longer route than necessary, needing the extra time to compose herself before facing an empty house that no longer felt entirely safe. When she arrived, she sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside, checking the locks on every door and window with a thoroughness she had never bothered with before, as if the walls of her own home might not be enough to protect her from whatever Daniel had gotten himself involved in. That night, unable to sleep, Laura decided to search Daniel's car while it was parked in the garage, reasoning that if there was anything more to find, it might be there rather than in the house itself. She used the spare key hanging by the back door, careful to move quietly despite being alone in the house, and let herself into the garage sometime after midnight. The car was clean, almost deliberately so, as if Daniel made a habit of removing anything personal before coming home each day. She checked the glove compartment first, finding only the registration, an owner's manual, and a handful of receipts for gas stations along his usual route to work. She checked beneath the seats, running her hand along the carpet, and found nothing but a stray coin and a child's forgotten hair tie from months earlier. She was about to give up when she noticed the trunk had a small compartment beneath the spare tire, slightly raised at one corner as though it had been opened and closed many times. Her hands shook as she lifted it, revealing a metal lockbox tucked into the space where the jack and tire tools should have been. The lockbox was not locked. Laura lifted the lid slowly, half expecting an alarm to sound, half expecting Daniel to appear in the garage doorway and ask what she was doing. Inside, she found several $1,000s in cash, banded in neat stacks, a second phone identical to the one she had found in his jacket weeks earlier, and a folded piece of paper covered in handwriting she recognized immediately as Daniel's. The paper contained a list of names, most of them unfamiliar, alongside dollar amounts and dates stretching back nearly 2 years. At the bottom of the list, circled twice in dark ink, was a name she did recognize, the same name from the sealed court filings she had found online. Beside it, the amount owed was larger than anything else on the page, and the date beside it was only 3 weeks away. Laura closed the lockbox carefully, returned it to its hiding place beneath the spare tire, and sat on the cold concrete floor of the garage for a long time, trying to understand the shape of what she had found. Whatever Daniel owed, and to whomever he owed it, the deadline was approaching quickly, and the envelope she had watched him hand over that evening suggested he was already trying, desperately, to pay some of it back before that deadline arrived. She thought about the children, asleep 2 hours away at her sister's house, blissfully unaware that their father might be counting down toward a debt that could put all of them in danger. She thought about the man in the expensive suit, the quiet menace in his posture even from a distance, the way the second man had scanned the parking lot like someone trained to notice threats before they arrived. For the first time since this had all begun, Laura allowed herself to fully consider the possibility that she and her children might not be safe in their own home, that whatever Daniel had built to protect them from his past might not be strong enough to hold against whatever was coming due in 3 weeks. She went back inside, locked the door behind her, and climbed the stairs to their bedroom, where Daniel lay sleeping, unaware that his wife now knew about the envelope, the lockbox, and the deadline circled twice in dark ink. She lay down beside him carefully, not touching him, staring at the ceiling until the first gray light of morning began creeping through the curtains. She had come looking for evidence of an affair, prepared to grieve the ordinary heartbreak of a husband who had strayed. What she found instead was far more frightening. A husband entangled in something dangerous enough to require a second identity, a hidden storage unit, and thousands of dollars in cash kept ready in the trunk of his car. The truth, she realized as the sun rose over their quiet suburban street, was not simply worse than betrayal. It was a truth that could cost them everything, and she now had less than 3 weeks to understand it fully, before whatever deadline Daniel was racing against finally arrived. Daniel woke a few hours later, stretching beside her as though the previous night had never happened, as though he had not stood in a hotel parking lot handing an envelope of cash to a man with cold, patient eyes. He kissed her shoulder, mumbled something about missing the children already, and got up to make coffee, his footsteps light and unhurried on the stairs. Laura lay in bed a moment longer, listening to the ordinary sounds of him moving through their kitchen, and marveled at how easily a person could carry 2 entirely different lives inside the same body. She joined him downstairs a few minutes later, forcing herself to act as though nothing had changed, pouring cereal into a bowl she did not intend to eat, and asking him mundane questions about the weekend ahead. Daniel answered easily, mentioned wanting to fix a loose gutter on the side of the house, suggested they might grill dinner that evening since the children were away. He seemed, if anything, lighter than he had in weeks, as though handing over that envelope had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders, at least for now. Laura watched him move around the kitchen and tried to reconcile this relaxed, ordinary version of her husband with the man she had watched the night before, tense and formal in a hotel parking lot, exchanging cash with people who looked like they belonged in a world entirely separate from soccer practice and gutter repairs. It struck her, not for the first time that week, how thoroughly a person could compartmentalize danger, folding it into a hidden drawer of themselves and closing the door so tightly that even a spouse of 8 years would never notice unless they went looking. She spent the rest of Saturday morning pretending to read a book on the back porch while her mind worked through everything she now knew. The list of names in the lockbox troubled her most. Most of them meant nothing to her, but a few, cross-referenced against her earlier research, seemed to match names connected to the same old business dispute she had found in the newspaper archive, the one involving unpaid loans and a company that had collapsed suddenly years before she had ever met Daniel. If her guess was right, this was not a new problem. It was an old one that had followed him quietly for years before finally catching up. Around noon, while Daniel was outside working on the gutter, Laura used the opportunity to search his study more carefully than she had before, checking behind books on the shelf, running her hand along the underside of drawers, looking for anything she might have missed during her earlier search. She found nothing new until she noticed a loose panel at the back of the closet, barely visible unless you already suspected something was hidden there. Behind the panel was a small fireproof document box, unlocked, containing a passport with Daniel's photograph and the name Vincent Marsh printed clearly on the identification page, along with several other documents, a birth certificate, a social security card, all bearing the same false name. Beneath those documents was a folded letter, handwritten, dated nearly 3 years earlier, addressed to no one in particular, as though Daniel had written it simply to organize his own thoughts. Laura read it quickly, her eyes scanning lines that described, in careful and guarded language, a decision made years before their marriage, a debt incurred through a business venture that had failed disastrously, and a choice to disappear from that old life entirely, rather than face the consequences of what he owed. The letter mentioned a name, Victor, written with an unmistakable undertone of fear even in Daniel's careful handwriting, describing him as a man who did not forget, and did not forgive easily, and who had a long memory for anyone who tried to walk away from what they owed him. She heard the gutter ladder shift outside and quickly returned everything to its place, sliding the panel back into position with hands that trembled more than she wanted to admit. She had wanted the truth, had told herself for days that whatever she found, she would face it with clear eyes and a steady hand. Now that she had it, spread out in fragments across a storage unit, a car trunk, and a hidden panel in their closet, she understood for the first time just how far that truth extended, and how much danger might already be standing at the edge of their ordinary, unremarkable life. That evening, they grilled dinner exactly as Daniel had suggested, the two of them sitting on the back porch under a sky just beginning to darken, plates balanced on their knees, talking about nothing important, the way they used to before all of this began. Laura found herself studying him across the small distance between their chairs, searching his face for some sign of the fear she now knew he carried, some crack in the calm exterior he presented to her every single day. She found it, eventually, in the way his eyes drifted toward the street every time a car passed slower than usual, in the way he checked his phone more often than he used to, always turning it face down again the moment he set it aside. He had built an entire second life to protect them from whatever was coming, and yet here he sat, trying to enjoy a quiet dinner with his wife, as though sheer effort of will could hold the danger at bay a little longer. Laura almost told him what she knew that night. The words rose in her throat more than once, an urge to simply ask him directly, to demand the whole truth instead of piecing it together in secret, fragment by fragment. But each time, she held back, remembering Claire's warning, remembering the deadline circled twice in dark ink, remembering that she still did not fully understand what she was dealing with, or what Daniel might do if he realized she had already found so much. Instead, she reached across the small table between their chairs and took his hand, the way she had 1,000 times before, and felt him relax slightly at her touch, unaware that the woman holding his hand now understood more about his hidden life than he had ever intended anyone to know. It was, she thought later that night, the strangest kind of intimacy, sitting beside a man she loved while carrying a secret of her own, one built entirely from his. The following week, Laura returned to the storage facility once more, this time photographing every document in the thick folder labeled with the letter V, determined to understand exactly how much Daniel owed and to whom. She found records suggesting the original debt, incurred through the failed business venture years earlier, had grown substantially over time, compounded by interest and penalties that seemed designed less to be repaid than to keep someone perpetually indebted, perpetually afraid. She found herself thinking, more than once, about the man named Victor, the cold, patient figure from the hotel parking lot, and wondering how a person built an entire empire out of other people's fear and desperation. Whatever kind of man he was, he had clearly been patient enough to wait years for Daniel to resurface, patient enough to let the debt grow quietly in the background while Daniel built an entirely new life, married, had children, settled into the kind of comfortable suburban existence that made his old life feel like a distant, forgettable dream. But debts like this, Laura was beginning to understand, were never truly forgotten. They waited, patiently, for the moment their debtor felt safest, and then they arrived at the door, unannounced, demanding payment in full. She thought of the deadline circled twice in dark ink, now less than 2 weeks away, and understood with growing certainty that whatever quiet peace they had built together as a family was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined possible when she first noticed her husband's phone turned face down on the kitchen counter. The second phone rang at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, buzzing softly against the wooden shelf inside Daniel's closet where Laura had hidden a small recording device 3 days earlier, purchased with cash from an electronics store an hour outside their town, far from anywhere she might be recognized. She lay perfectly still beside Daniel, listening to him stir, listening to his feet hit the floor and cross the room toward the closet. He answered in a low voice, careful not to wake her, though Laura had not been asleep at all. She kept her breathing slow and even, straining to catch fragments of his side of the conversation through the mostly closed door. "I told you, I'm getting the rest together," Daniel said, his voice tight with a strain she had rarely heard from him. 10 days. That's what we agreed on. A pause, during which Laura imagined the man on the other end of the line, patient and cold, exactly as he had appeared in that hotel parking lot. "I understand what happens if I don't," Daniel said finally, his voice dropping lower still. "You don't need to remind me." He ended the call and stood in the closet for a long moment before returning to bed, and Laura felt him settle beside her, his body tense even in stillness, his breathing shallow and uneven for nearly an hour before sleep finally claimed him. She lay awake long after that, replaying his words, trying to calculate exactly how much danger those 10 days represented. The recording device captured only fragments, not enough to piece together the full amount he owed, but enough to confirm what Laura had already begun to suspect from the documents in the storage unit. Whatever Daniel had promised to pay, he did not yet have all of it, and the man on the other end of that call was not someone inclined toward patience or mercy. The next morning, after Daniel left for work, Laura retrieved the recording device and listened to the conversation again in the privacy of her car, parked in the school pickup line nearly an hour before the children were due out, the radio off, her hands gripping the wheel as she replayed the same 12 seconds 3 times, trying to catch any details she might have missed. She heard the fear beneath Daniel's controlled voice, a fear she recognized because she had been living inside her own version of it for weeks now. She called Claire again that evening, once the children were asleep and Daniel had taken his laptop into the garage the way he often did now, claiming extra work deadlines that Laura no longer entirely believed. "I think it's almost time," Laura said quietly into the phone. "Whatever this is, it's coming to a head soon. He mentioned 10 days on a call last night." Claire was silent for a moment. "Have you thought about what you're going to do?" "If this is as dangerous as it sounds, Laura, you and the kids might need a plan that doesn't involve waiting around to see how it plays out." "I know," Laura said, though the words felt heavier than she expected saying them aloud. "I keep thinking about just taking the kids to your place until this passes. But if I do that without telling him why, he'll know I've found something. And if I tell him what I know, I don't know how he'll react, or whether it puts us in more danger, not less." "You could also just ask him," Claire said gently. "Laura, at some point, you have to actually talk to him. You can't keep circling around this forever, gathering evidence like you're building a case against a stranger. He's your husband. Whatever he's done, he deserves the chance to explain it to your face, and you deserve to hear it from him instead of from a folder in a storage unit." Laura knew her sister was right, but something in her still resisted the idea of confrontation, some instinct telling her she needed more information first, needed to understand the full shape of the danger before she gave Daniel any indication that she already knew as much as she did. She promised Claire she would think about it and ended the call feeling no closer to a decision than she had been an hour earlier. Over the following days, Laura noticed small changes in Daniel's behavior that confirmed her fears were not misplaced. He began locking the doors earlier in the evening, checking the windows twice before bed, a habit he had never had before. He flinched, once, when a delivery truck pulled into their driveway unexpectedly, his hand moving instinctively toward the window before he caught himself and forced a laugh, explaining he'd simply been startled by the noise. He also began withdrawing cash in small amounts from their joint account, transactions Laura noticed only because she had started checking their bank statements daily, something she had never bothered to do before all of this began. The withdrawals were not large enough to draw attention on their own, but added together over the course of a week, they suggested Daniel was quietly assembling more money than she had realized, likely trying to reach whatever figure had been agreed upon during that 10-day deadline. Laura began to fear, increasingly, that their savings, the money they had set aside for their children's education, for the modest home renovations they had discussed for years, was being slowly redirected toward paying off a debt she had never known existed until a few weeks earlier. It was one thing to discover her husband was hiding a dangerous secret. It was another entirely to realize that secret was quietly draining the financial security she had spent years helping to build for their family. She confronted the bank statements with a kind of cold clarity, calculating exactly how much had been withdrawn over the past month, cross-referencing it against the figures she had photographed in the storage unit folder. The numbers did not quite add up to the full amount circled in dark ink on Daniel's handwritten list, which meant he was still short, still scrambling, with less than 10 days remaining to close the gap. On Thursday evening, while Daniel was in the shower, Laura searched his study once more, checking the fireproof document box behind the closet panel, and found it nearly empty. Most of the cash she had seen there weeks earlier now gone, presumably transferred into whatever payment he was assembling. Only the false identification documents remained, along with the handwritten letter she had read once before, its edges now slightly worn from what she assumed were Daniel's own repeated readings during sleepless nights she had not known he was having. She sat on the closet floor for a long moment, the document box open in her lap, and allowed herself, for the first time, to fully imagine the worst possible outcome. Not simply financial ruin, though that alone would be devastating enough, but real physical danger. The kind implied by a man who did not forget and did not forgive easily. The kind that could reach into a quiet suburban home and shatter everything inside it without warning. She thought about her children, their easy laughter at dinner, their complete unawareness of the danger that might be gathering just outside the edges of their ordinary lives. She thought about the hotel parking lot, the envelope of cash, the second man scanning the area like someone trained to notice threats before they arrived. Whatever protection Daniel believed he was buying with these payments, Laura was no longer certain it would be enough, or that 10 days was truly all the time they had left before everything came apart. That night, lying beside Daniel in the dark, Laura made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She could not keep gathering fragments of the truth indefinitely, watching from a careful distance while the danger crept closer to their door. Whatever came next, whatever it cost her, she needed to hear the full truth directly from her husband, not pieced together from hidden folders and half-heard phone calls. She needed him to look her in the eye and tell her exactly what they were facing, and exactly what it would take to keep their family safe. Before that conversation arrived, though, Laura spent one more day gathering whatever pieces of the truth still remained hidden from her, wanting to walk into whatever discussion came next with as much understanding as she could manage. She woke early, before the children, and used the quiet morning hours to go through Daniel's email account, a password she had memorized years ago and never once needed to use until now. Most of his messages were ordinary, work-related correspondence, a few newsletters he never bothered to unsubscribe from, occasional messages from his mother about weekend visits. But buried in a folder he had labeled simply as Archive, Laura found a series of exchanges from several years earlier, before their marriage, written in careful, guarded language that mirrored the letter she had found behind the closet panel. The earliest messages described a business partnership gone wrong, an investment scheme that had promised steady returns and instead collapsed within 18 months, taking with it not only Daniel's own savings but money he had borrowed from several people connected to a man named Victor, described in the emails only in the vaguest terms, as someone whose patience should never be tested twice. Later messages grew increasingly desperate, describing threats that had escalated from simple phone calls to visits at Daniel's old apartment, to a warning delivered through a mutual acquaintance that made it clear his safety could no longer be guaranteed if the debt remained unpaid. The final message in the folder, dated just months before Laura had first met Daniel at a mutual friend's engagement party, described his decision to disappear entirely, to build a new identity under a different name, and to start over somewhere Victor's reach could not easily follow. Laura closed the laptop and sat very still, understanding now with painful clarity that the man she had fallen in love with at that engagement party had already been running from something even then, already carrying a secret so heavy it had required him to erase an entire version of himself just to survive it. She thought about how gentle he had been with her in those early months, how carefully he had built their life together, and wondered now whether some part of that carefulness had always been about protecting the fragile peace he had fought so hard to create. It did not excuse the years of silence, the lies stacked quietly on top of one another until they formed the foundation of their entire marriage, but it did explain, in a way that softened some of her anger even as her fear continued to grow, why he had never told her, why he had let her believe their life together was built on nothing more complicated than ordinary love and ordinary struggles. He had been trying, she realized, to give her and their children a life free from the danger that had once nearly destroyed him, even if that meant keeping them all in the dark about how close that danger truly remained. That afternoon, while folding laundry in the quiet of their bedroom, Laura found herself imagining the conversation she knew was coming, rehearsing questions she wanted to ask, bracing herself for answers she was not sure she was ready to hear. Would Daniel tell her the truth willingly, once she finally confronted him, or would she have to lay out everything she had found, piece by piece, before he stopped denying it? Would he be relieved to finally share the weight of this secret with someone? Or would he see her discovery as a betrayal of the careful world he had built to protect her from exactly this kind of fear? She thought, too, about what came next, regardless of how the conversation unfolded. If the debt truly needed to be paid within days, and their savings were not enough to cover it, what happened when that deadline arrived and Victor's patience finally ran out entirely? She had read enough in those old emails to understand that patience, once exhausted, did not simply disappear. It transformed into something far more dangerous, something that could reach far beyond Daniel alone and touch the family he had worked so hard to protect. By evening, Laura had made peace with the fact that she could not control how the coming conversation would unfold, only how honestly she chose to enter it. She resolved to tell Daniel everything she had found: the storage unit, the identification documents, the recorded phone call, the withdrawals from their savings account, rather than allowing him to control the pace of a truth she had already uncovered largely on her own. Whatever happened next, she wanted it built on complete honesty between them, not another layer of careful half-truths designed to protect her from something she had already seen far too clearly to be protected from any longer. She did not know, lying awake in the darkness that night, that she would not have to wait long for that conversation. The following evening, Daniel would come home earlier than usual, his face pale and his hands unsteady, and finally, after weeks of careful silence, tell her everything. Daniel's car pulled into the driveway at 5:30, nearly 2 hours earlier than his usual return, and Laura knew before he even opened the front door that something had shifted. She heard his key fumble twice against the lock before finally finding its place, an unusual clumsiness from a man who moved through the world with such careful precision. He stepped inside, pale and unsteady, his tie loosened, his jacket rumpled in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through his hair repeatedly throughout the day. Laura stood in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel still in her hands, and watched him set his bag down with none of his usual care, letting it slide off his shoulder and land haphazardly by the stairs. "Daniel," she said quietly, "what happened?" He looked up at her, and for a moment, something in his expression cracked entirely. The careful composure he had maintained for weeks, finally giving way to something raw and frightened underneath. He opened his mouth as if to offer another excuse, another vague explanation about work, and then seemed to simply run out of the energy required to keep lying. "We need to talk," he said instead, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are the kids upstairs?" "They're at Claire's for the night," Laura said. She had arranged it that morning, some instinct telling her this conversation was coming sooner than she expected. "It's just us." Daniel nodded slowly and sank into a kitchen chair, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes for a long moment before finally looking up at her. Laura sat down across from him, setting the dish towel aside, and waited, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it across the small table between them. "There are things about my life before we met that I never told you," Daniel began, his voice unsteady. "Things I should have told you a long time ago, before we got married, before we had children, before any of this became something you had to be a part of." "I know," Laura said quietly. Daniel's head snapped up, confusion and something close to fear crossing his face. "What do you mean, you know?" "I found the storage unit," Laura said, her voice steady, even though her hands were trembling beneath the table. "The identification card, Vincent Marsh. I found the lockbox in your car, the emails in your archive folder, the letter behind the closet panel. I know about the debt, Daniel. I know about Victor. I followed you to the hotel 3 weeks ago and watched you hand him an envelope in the parking lot." The color drained further from Daniel's face, and for a long moment, he simply stared at her across the table, unable to form any words at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "How long have you known?" "Weeks," Laura said. "I wanted to understand everything before I said anything. I needed to know what we were actually facing before I confronted you about it." Daniel put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly, and for a moment Laura thought he might actually be crying, something she had seen him do only once before, the day their daughter was born. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear, as though some enormous weight had finally, after years, begun to lift from his chest. "I was 26 when it started," he said slowly. "A friend from college convinced me to invest in a business venture, real estate development, guaranteed returns, all the things that sound too good to be true because they are too good to be true. I put in everything I had saved and then I borrowed more, from people I shouldn't have borrowed from, people connected to a man named Victor Aldrich, who financed loans for people the regular banks wouldn't touch." He paused, his hands wrapped tightly around an empty coffee mug on the table, more for something to hold on to than any real intention of drinking from it. "The business collapsed within 18 months. Everyone lost money, but I owed more than anyone else, because I'd borrowed so much of it from Victor directly. He gave me time, at first, more patience than I expected, but eventually that patience ran out. There were threats. Not just words, Laura. Someone broke into my apartment. I found out later they'd been following me for weeks before that, learning my schedule, learning who I spent time with. Laura's stomach tightened, imagining a younger version of Daniel living through exactly the kind of fear she had only recently begun to understand herself. Why didn't you go to the police? I tried. Once, Daniel said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. Victor's operation was careful. And everything looked legitimate on paper. Private loans between consenting adults, nothing the police could act on without evidence I didn't have. And the officer I spoke to as good as told me that without something concrete, there wasn't much they could do. Not until something worse had already happened. He described then, the months that followed, changing apartments twice, working under a different name at a job that paid him in cash, slowly building the identity of Vincent Marsh as a kind of insurance policy, someone he could disappear into if things ever became truly dangerous. He had genuinely believed, for a while, that he had done exactly that. Disappeared thoroughly enough that Victor would eventually give up the search and move on to easier targets. I met you 2 years after all of that started, Daniel said, his voice softening. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself believe I'd actually gotten away from it. I fell in love with you, Laura, completely. And I told myself that as long as I kept paying down what I owed quietly, kept my old name buried, none of it would ever have to touch you or the kids. But it did touch us, Laura said. It's been touching us for months, Daniel. Longer, maybe, without either of us fully realizing it. Daniel nodded, his expression heavy with guilt. Victor found me again about 4 months ago. I don't know exactly how. Maybe an old associate recognized me somewhere. Maybe he simply never stopped looking as thoroughly as I hoped he had. He reached out through an intermediary first, polite at first, almost friendly, just reminding me the debt still existed, that interest had been accumulating for years, that he expected it to finally be settled. The amount on that list I found, Laura said. Is that what he's asking for? That's what remains after years of partial payments, Daniel said quietly. I've been paying him back slowly this whole time, Laura. Small amounts, whenever I could manage it without you noticing, hoping I could clear it entirely before he ever had reason to come looking harder. But 4 months ago, he decided he was done waiting for small payments. He wants the rest, all of it, within a deadline, or he's made it clear there will be consequences that go beyond just financial ones. Laura felt the full weight of what he was describing settle over her. The careful, secret payments stretching back years, hidden entirely from her even as they built a life together, bought a house, raised 2 children who had no idea their family's financial foundation had been quietly compromised from the very beginning. How much do you still owe him? She asked, and how much do we actually have? Daniel told her the figure, and Laura felt her chest tighten as she did the math silently, comparing it against what remained in their savings after the withdrawals she had already tracked over the past weeks. The gap between what Victor demanded and what they could realistically gather was significant, large enough that even selling the car, even borrowing against the house, might not fully close it before the deadline arrived. There's still 4 days left, Daniel said, reading the calculation on her face. I've been trying to close the gap through legitimate savings, extra shifts, anything I could manage without drawing attention. I didn't want you to know any of this, Laura. I wanted to handle it myself, the way I always have, and let you keep believing our life together was simple and safe. It stopped being simple the moment you married me without telling me any of this, Laura said, her voice sharper than she intended. Years of buried hurt finally finding its way to the surface. I understand you were scared. I understand you thought you were protecting us. But Daniel, I've spent weeks investigating my own husband like a stranger, wondering if the man I married even exists, terrified for our children without understanding why. That fear was real, whether or not you meant to cause it. Daniel reached across the table, hesitant, as though unsure whether she would allow him to take her hand. When she did not pull away, he held it gently, his eyes searching hers for some sign of what she intended to do next. I'm sorry, he said, the words simple, but clearly carrying years of unspoken guilt behind them. I should have told you before we got married. I should have trusted you enough to let you decide, with full knowledge, whether this was a risk you were willing to share with me. Instead, I made that decision for you, and I let you build a family on a foundation you never got to fully understand. Laura sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything he had told her, weighing the fear and anger she felt against the raw honesty finally sitting across the table from her. She thought about the letter she had found behind the closet panel, the desperate hope in his handwriting that he might one day be free of this entirely. She thought about the 10 days he had mentioned on that recorded phone call, now reduced to 4, and the very real danger that remained if they could not find a way to close the gap in time. "We need a plan," she said finally, her voice steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. "Not just for the payment, Daniel. For all of it. If Victor doesn't get what he wants in 4 days, what happens next? What are we actually facing?" Daniel's expression darkened, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, Laura saw genuine fear cross his face. Fear not for himself, she realized, but for her and their children. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "But based on what happened years ago, based on what his associate implied during our last conversation, I don't think he's the kind of man who simply walks away empty-handed. If we can't pay what he's asking, I think he intends to make an example of what happens to people who try." The words hung heavy in the quiet kitchen, and Laura understood, finally, the full shape of the danger they were facing together. Whatever came next, whatever it required of them, she knew there was no more room for secrets between them. No more room for Daniel to carry this weight alone, believing silence was somehow the same thing as protection. Together, they would have to find a way through the next 4 days, or risk losing far more than the money Victor Aldrich believed he was owed. They sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had set, the room lit only by a single overhead light, mapping out every possible option available to them. Daniel suggested selling his car outright rather than simply borrowing against it, reasoning that a quick cash sale, even at a loss, would move faster than any loan approval process could manage within 4 days. Laura raised the possibility of asking Claire for help, though she hesitated even as she said it, unwilling to pull her sister's family into danger that rightfully belonged only to their own household. "We can't involve her directly," Daniel said firmly. "Not with money, not with anything that puts her name anywhere near this. If Victor decides to look beyond us for leverage, I don't want anyone else exposed to that risk." Laura nodded, though the thought of facing this alone, without her sister's steady presence beside her, left a hollow feeling in her chest. She thought of another option instead, one she had been quietly considering since first uncovering the sealed court records weeks earlier. "What about the police?" she asked again, more insistent this time than when she had first raised the question. "Not the way you tried years ago, with nothing but suspicion and no evidence. I have photographs, Daniel. Documents from the storage unit, the recorded phone call, dates and figures that match the sealed case from years ago. That's not nothing anymore." Daniel considered this for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly between his hands. "It's still a risk. If Victor finds out we've gone to the authorities before any arrest actually happens, before he's actually stopped, it could accelerate exactly the kind of consequences we're trying to avoid." "And if we don't go to them at all," Laura countered, "we're trusting that paying him everything he asks will actually be the end of it. Debts like this don't usually end just because one payment finally satisfies someone like him. You said so yourself. He let this grow for years, collecting interest on top of interest. What happens in another 2 years, when he decides he wants more again?" Daniel had no easy answer for that, and Laura watched the truth of her own words settle over him slowly, a realization he seemed to have avoided facing directly until she said it aloud. Paying Victor now might buy them time, but it would not necessarily buy them safety, not permanently, not in any way that let them stop looking over their shoulders entirely. They spent the next hour drafting a careful plan, one that combined both approaches rather than choosing between them entirely. Daniel would continue gathering as much of the remaining payment as possible over the following days, selling the car, withdrawing what remained of their retirement savings despite the painful cost of doing so early. At the same time, Laura would quietly compile everything she had gathered, the photographs, the recordings, the documents, into a single organized file, ready to hand over to the authorities the moment it became clear paying Victor alone would not be enough to guarantee their safety. It was not a perfect plan. Both of them understood that, but it felt, for the first time in weeks, like something they were facing together rather than something Daniel carried alone in secret, while Laura investigated from the shadows, each of them separately terrified without the other's full knowledge or support. Near midnight, exhausted from hours of careful planning and difficult honesty, Laura finally asked the question that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else since Daniel first sat down at the table. "Do you regret marrying me without telling me any of this?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening into something closer to the man she had fallen in love with years earlier, before any of this fear had settled permanently into the lines of his face. "I regret the lying," he said. "I will regret that for the rest of my life, however this turns out. But I have never once regretted choosing you, Laura. If anything, you're the reason I fought as hard as I did to keep this old life buried. I wanted so badly to give you and the kids something safe, something normal, and I convinced myself that silence was the only way to protect that. Silence almost cost us everything anyway, Laura said quietly. If I hadn't started looking, if I hadn't found the storage unit and the emails and the lockbox, would you have ever told me any of this? Or would I have simply woken up one day to find out something terrible had already happened? Daniel did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than any words could have. She understood, in that moment, that he might never have told her voluntarily, might have continued carrying this secret alone indefinitely, believing until the very end that protecting her meant keeping her entirely in the dark, even as the danger grew close enough to touch their children's lives directly. It was a hard truth to sit with, but Laura found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want to spend what remained of that night dwelling on it. There would be time later, once the immediate danger had passed, to fully grieve the years of secrecy that had shaped their marriage without her knowledge or consent. For now, there was only the narrow window of 4 days ahead of them, and the urgent work of surviving it together. They went to bed close to 1 in the morning, neither of them expecting to sleep, and for a long while they simply lay beside each other in the dark, Daniel's hand finding hers beneath the blankets the way it had 1,000 times before, though this time it carried a different weight entirely, a fragile, tentative kind of trust being rebuilt from the wreckage of years of silence, one careful moment at a time. The knock on the door came at 9 in the evening, exactly 4 days after Daniel had finally told Laura everything, and the sound alone was enough to make both of them go completely still in the middle of the kitchen, plates of half-eaten dinner forgotten between them. Daniel had managed to gather nearly all of the remaining amount over those 4 days, selling his car for a fraction of its worth, draining the last of their retirement savings, borrowing what little he could from a coworker who asked no questions. It still fell short, by an amount that felt small on paper and enormous in the tense silence that followed each calculation, roughly $8,000 less than what Victor Aldrich had demanded. Laura had spent those same 4 days organizing everything she'd gathered into a single folder, copies of the photographs, the recorded phone call transferred onto a small drive, printed pages from the sealed court records she had found online. She had also, without telling Daniel until the 3rd day, contacted a detective 2 counties over, a woman named Grace Okafor who specialized in cases involving predatory lending and organized financial threats, someone Claire had found through a careful search after Laura finally admitted everything to her sister in full. Detective Okafor had listened carefully during their first phone call, asked precise questions about dates and figures, and told Laura plainly that what she described sounded like a pattern her department had encountered before, though rarely with this much documentation gathered independently by someone outside law enforcement. She could not promise protection before an actual threat occurred, she explained, but she could have officers positioned nearby if Laura was willing to let her know when and where any payment exchange was scheduled to take place. The knock at the door, however, was not part of any scheduled exchange. It was 4 days early, and far too close to their own home for either of them to feel anything but immediate, overwhelming alarm. Daniel moved toward the door slowly, gesturing for Laura to stay back near the kitchen, but she followed anyway, unwilling to let him face whatever waited on the other side alone. Through the narrow window beside the door, she recognized the second man from the hotel parking lot, the quiet one who had stood a step behind Victor, scanning the area with careful, practiced eyes. Daniel opened the door only partway, his body positioned to block the view into the house behind him. "This isn't the arrangement," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "We agreed on 4 more days. Mr. Aldrich wants to move things up," the man said flatly. "He's grown concerned about your reliability, given some unusual activity he's noticed lately. Calls made to certain offices. He'd like to discuss it in person, tonight." Laura's stomach dropped. Somehow, Victor had learned about her contact with Detective Okafor, or at least suspected enough to grow suspicious. She thought of every phone call she had made from her car, every precaution she had taken to avoid using their home line, and wondered where exactly the leak had occurred, or whether Victor's paranoia alone had been enough to accelerate his timeline without any real evidence at all. "I need to make a call first," Daniel said carefully. "Give me 10 minutes." The man's expression did not change. "5, he said, before stepping back off the porch and returning to a car parked at the curb, engine idling, clearly prepared to wait exactly as long as he'd said, and not a moment longer. Daniel closed the door and turned to Laura, his face pale, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. "I have to call Detective Okafor, now. If they're moving this up, we don't have time to wait for a scheduled exchange." Laura found the detective's number in her own phone and dialed with trembling fingers, putting the call on speaker so Daniel could hear, as she explained quickly what had just happened: the unexpected visit, the accelerated timeline, the car waiting outside their house at that very moment. Detective Okafor's voice remained calm and steady throughout, a stark contrast to the panic rising in Laura's own chest. "Listen to me carefully," Okafor said. "Do not go anywhere with that man tonight, and do not let Daniel go anywhere alone either. Tell them you need until tomorrow morning to finalize the payment, that you're waiting on funds to clear from a bank transfer. That buys us time to get officers positioned near your location without alerting them that anything has changed. What if they don't accept that?" Laura asked, her voice barely steady. "Most people like this prefer patience over unnecessary risk, especially if there's genuine money still coming," Okafor said. "Threatening you outright, before payment, gains him nothing. Stall if you can. I'm sending a unit to your street right now, unmarked, just in case things escalate faster than we expect." Daniel opened the door again exactly as the 5 minutes expired, the man from the car already halfway back up the walkway. "We need until tomorrow morning," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear Laura could see clearly in his eyes. "The remaining funds are still clearing. I can have everything, in full, by 9 tomorrow." The man studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally nodding once. 9 o'clock. Mr. Aldrich does not appreciate being kept waiting twice. He returned to the car, and Daniel watched through the window as it pulled away from the curb, not relaxing even slightly until the taillights had disappeared completely around the corner at the end of their street. Laura found herself shaking uncontrollably once the danger had passed, adrenaline draining out of her all at once, leaving her legs unsteady beneath her. They spent that night barely sleeping, Detective Okafor's promised unmarked car parked a discreet distance down the street, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. Daniel and Laura sat together in the living room for most of the night, the television on but unwatched, simply needing each other's presence in the room as they waited for morning to arrive. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Daniel said quietly, "sometime after 2 in the morning, I need you to know that none of this was worth what it's cost you. I thought I was protecting you by staying silent, but all I really did was leave you unprepared for something I always knew, deep down, might eventually find its way to our door." Laura leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted in a way that went far beyond simple tiredness. "We're going to get through this," she said, though she was not entirely certain she believed it herself. "And when we do, there won't be any more secrets between us. Whatever comes next, we face it together, completely honest, or we don't face it at all." Morning arrived gray and quiet, the street outside their house deceptively ordinary, neighbors walking dogs and loading children into cars for school exactly as they did every other day, unaware of the tension coiled tightly inside the house at the end of the block. At 8:30, Detective Okafor called to confirm her team was in position, plainclothes officers stationed at both ends of the street, ready to move the moment Victor or his associates appeared. Daniel drove to the arranged meeting location alone, as instructed, a parking garage downtown chosen by Victor's associate the night before. Laura waited at home, following Okafor's insistence that her presence would only complicate an already dangerous situation, though the waiting itself felt like its own particular form of agony, every minute stretching unbearably as she stared at her phone, willing it to ring with news that everything had gone according to plan. At 9:15, her phone finally rang, and Laura answered before the first ring had even finished, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear Detective Okafor's voice on the other end. "It's over," Okafor said. "We took Victor Aldrich into custody the moment the exchange began, along with 2 of his associates. Daniel is safe, he's giving a statement now, but he's completely unharmed." Laura sank onto the kitchen floor, relief crashing over her so suddenly and completely that she found herself crying for the first time in weeks, tears she had been holding back through every careful, frightened day since this had all begun. She thanked the detective repeatedly, though Okafor gently reminded her the real work of building a case would still take time, that Daniel's documentation and testimony would be crucial in ensuring Victor faced consequences serious enough to guarantee he could never threaten another family the way he had threatened theirs. Daniel came home 2 hours later, exhausted but unmistakably lighter than she had seen him in months, the weight of years finally beginning to lift from his shoulders now that the truth was fully out in the open, no longer something he carried alone in careful, guarded silence. In the weeks that followed, the full case against Victor Aldrich began taking shape, built substantially on the evidence Laura had gathered during those anxious weeks of quiet investigation. Detective Okafor's team uncovered several other victims willing to come forward once they learned Victor was finally facing real consequences. each new testimony strengthening a case that would eventually see him held fully accountable for years of predatory lending and threats stretching back far longer than even Daniel had fully understood. Daniel officially closed the door on his old identity, cooperating fully with investigators to ensure the false documents connected to Vincent Marsh were properly accounted for and closed out, a final formal end to the second life he had built out of fear so many years earlier. It felt, he told Laura one evening, like finally being allowed to exist as only one person again, instead of constantly managing the careful boundary between who he actually was and who he had pretended to be. Their marriage did not simply return to what it had been before, and Laura found she did not want it to. What emerged instead was something different, built more slowly and more deliberately on the kind of complete honesty they had never quite managed in their earlier years together. They began seeing a counselor regularly, working through the trust that had been damaged by years of hidden secrets, rebuilding it piece by piece with the same careful patience Daniel had once used to hide from Victor, now redirected entirely toward healing what remained of their family. Their children never learned the full details of what their parents had faced during those tense weeks, though they noticed, in the simple way children notice things, that something between their mother and father had shifted afterward, a new closeness, a habit of checking in with each other more often, quiet conversations held at the kitchen table long after bedtime that ended, more often than not, with quiet laughter instead of tension. Laura thought often, in the months that followed, about the version of herself who had first noticed Daniel's phone turned face down on the kitchen counter, certain she was only facing the ordinary heartbreak of infidelity. She had been prepared, back then, to grieve a simple kind of betrayal. What she found instead had tested her in ways she never could have anticipated, forcing her to become braver and more resourceful than she had ever known herself capable of being. She understood now that the truth, however frightening, however far it had ultimately taken her from the comfortable assumptions she once held about her own marriage, had been worth pursuing entirely. A life built on silence, however well-intentioned, was never truly safe, not for her, and not for the children who depended on both their parents to protect them honestly, rather than simply shielding them from difficult truths. Standing in her kitchen one quiet evening, watching Daniel help their daughter with a school project at the very table where he had finally told her everything, Laura felt something settle inside her that had been missing for months, a fragile but genuine sense of peace, built not on the absence of danger, but on the presence, finally, of complete and unwavering honesty between them. The trial, when it finally arrived nearly a year later, brought its own difficult chapter for both of them. Laura sat in the courtroom gallery every day it was in session, watching Daniel testify with a steadiness that surprised her, describing years of fear and careful evasion, in a voice that no longer trembled the way it once had during those anxious nights at their kitchen table. Detective Okafor's case, strengthened by the additional victims who had come forward, proved thorough enough that Victor Aldrich was ultimately convicted on multiple counts, receiving a sentence long enough to guarantee he would never again have the opportunity to threaten another family the way he had threatened theirs. Outside the courthouse on the final day, Laura and Daniel stood together on the steps, blinking against unexpectedly bright sunlight, both of them feeling the strange, disorienting relief of an ending that had taken so long to arrive it almost did not feel real. Claire met them there, having taken time off work every day of the trial to sit beside her sister in the gallery, and the three of them embraced for a long moment before finally heading home together. The weight of years finally, truly lifted. Rebuilding their finances took considerably longer than resolving the legal case had. The money spent closing out the debt, combined with legal costs during the investigation, had left them with little cushion, and for the first year afterward, Laura and Daniel lived more carefully than they ever had before, tracking every expense, rebuilding their savings slowly and deliberately. Strangely, Laura found she did not mind the careful budgeting nearly as much as she once might have. There was a kind of comfort in it, a sense of building something honestly from the ground up, free from any hidden obligations lurking beneath the surface. Daniel changed jobs eventually, moving to a smaller company where the hours were more predictable and the stress considerably lower, a deliberate choice on his part to prioritize time with his family over the kind of demanding career he had once used, Laura suspected, partly as a distraction from the fear he carried privately for so many years. He began coaching their son's soccer team on weekends, something he had always wanted to do but had never quite found the emotional space for while still managing the secret weight of his old life. Laura, for her part, found herself changed in ways she had not fully expected. The months spent quietly investigating, gathering evidence, learning to trust her own instincts even when the truth in front of her seemed impossible to believe, had left her with a quiet confidence she carried into other areas of her life as well. She returned to work part-time the following year, taking a position she had once assumed she was not qualified for, surprising herself with how capable she felt walking into that interview, armed with the knowledge that she had once tracked down a hidden storage unit and pieced together a criminal case entirely on her own initiative. Their marriage counselor, a patient woman named Grace, though unrelated to the detective who shared her first name, helped them establish new habits that neither of them had practiced consistently before. Regular check-ins where they discussed not just logistics and schedules but genuine fears and uncertainties. A standing agreement that no subject, however uncomfortable, was ever entirely off limits between them again. It was not always easy. Old habits of careful silence occasionally crept back in, moments where Daniel caught himself softening a worry before sharing it, or Laura noticed herself hesitating before raising a concern that felt too small to bother him with. But each time, they caught it, named it, and corrected course together, slowly building the kind of trust that could only be earned through consistent, deliberate honesty over time, rather than declared once and assumed permanent. Laura came to understand that trust, once broken as deeply as theirs had been, did not simply return because the danger had passed. It had to be rebuilt patiently, brick by brick, through countless small moments of choosing truth over comfort, again and again, until eventually those small, honest moments outnumbered the years of silence that had come before them. 2 years after the trial concluded, on a warm evening in early autumn, Laura found the old storage unit key, sitting forgotten in the bottom of a drawer while cleaning out the home office, a relic from a life they had both worked hard to leave behind. She held it for a long moment, remembering the fear and determination of the woman who had first turned it in a rusted lock 2 towns away, searching for answers she was not entirely certain she wanted to find. She showed it to Daniel that evening, and together they decided, without much discussion needed, that it belonged in the trash rather than tucked away as some kind of keepsake. There was nothing worth preserving about the secrecy it represented, only the strength it had ultimately taken both of them to overcome it. Daniel dropped it into the bin himself, a small, quiet gesture that meant more than either of them said aloud in that moment. That night, sitting together on their back porch as the sun set over their quiet street, their children's laughter drifting out from the house behind them, Laura reached for Daniel's hand the way she had 1,000 times before. This time there was no hidden weight beneath the gesture, no second life waiting quietly in the shadows, no careful calculations about how much truth was safe to share. There was only the simple, hard-won honesty of 2 people who had faced the worst version of their story together, and had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build something better in its place. 6 months before the trial began, a letter arrived at their house with no return address, slipped into the mailbox sometime overnight, rather than delivered through the regular postal service. Laura found it while gathering the morning mail, an ordinary white envelope that felt anything but ordinary the moment she noticed her name and Daniel's both printed on the front in careful block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, warning them in vague but unmistakable terms that testifying against Victor Aldrich would have consequences that extended beyond the courtroom. It mentioned no names directly, made no explicit threats that could easily be proven in a court of law, but the implication was clear enough to send a fresh wave of fear through the careful peace they had only just begun rebuilding. Laura called Detective Okafor immediately, her hands shaking as she read the letter aloud over the phone. Okafor listened carefully, asked her to photograph the envelope and letter without touching them further, and arranged for an officer to collect it that same afternoon for analysis. "This isn't unusual, unfortunately," Okafor explained gently. "Sometimes associates who weren't directly implicated try to discourage witnesses before a trial. It doesn't mean Victor authorized it personally, but it does mean we need to take your safety seriously in the months leading up to your testimony." The department arranged for periodic patrols past their house over the following weeks, and Okafor connected them with a victim's advocate, who helped them understand the legal protections available to witnesses in cases like theirs. Still, the letter cast a long shadow over what had been, until that point, a slowly steadying sense of normalcy. Daniel began walking their children to the bus stop each morning instead of letting them wait alone, a small habit that neither of them discussed directly, but that both quietly understood. Laura found herself lying awake some nights again, listening for unfamiliar sounds outside their window, the old fear resurfacing in ways she thought she had already moved past. She mentioned this during one of their counseling sessions, and Grace, their counselor, reminded her gently that healing from prolonged fear rarely moved in a straight line, that setbacks like this letter did not erase the progress they had already made, even when they made that progress harder to feel in the moment. "You survived the worst of it already," Grace told her. "This is frightening, And it's valid to feel frightened by it, but you're not facing it the way you once did, alone and in secret. You have Daniel beside you now. You have people who know the full truth and are actively working to protect you. That's a fundamentally different position than the one you were in a year ago. Laura held on to those words in the weeks that followed, reminding herself of them each time fear threatened to overwhelm the careful stability they had built. Daniel, for his part, channeled his own anxiety into preparation, working closely with the prosecuting attorney to ensure his testimony would be as thorough and airtight as possible, determined that whatever fear the anonymous letter had been designed to create would not succeed in silencing him. 3 weeks after the letter arrived, an unfamiliar car began appearing on their street with unusual frequency, parked for long stretches at a time without any obvious purpose, always gone by the time a patrol officer arrived to check on it. Laura noted the license plate the third time she saw it and passed the information along to Okafor, who traced it back to a man named Elias Cronin, a former associate of Victor's who had not been charged in the original case due to insufficient evidence at the time. Okafor's team began monitoring the situation more closely, eventually observing Cronin photograph their house from his car one evening, an action that gave them enough grounds to bring him in for questioning. Under pressure, and facing the possibility of obstruction charges connected to witness intimidation, Cronin ultimately admitted he had sent the anonymous letter himself, hoping to discourage Daniel's testimony without direct orders from Victor, acting instead out of his own fear that a thorough trial might eventually implicate him as well. The admission brought a strange kind of relief, confirming that the threat, while real and frightening, had not come from some larger, more coordinated danger they could not fully anticipate or control. Cronin was charged separately for witness intimidation, adding yet another layer to the growing case against everyone who had participated in Victor's operation over the years, and the patrols outside their house continued until his own case was resolved months later. Laura remembered, afterward, how strange it felt to sit across from Detective Okafor as she explained all of this, feeling something close to gratitude that the danger, however real, had at least turned out to have a name and a face, rather than remaining an unknowable threat lurking indefinitely at the edges of their lives. Fear was always more bearable, she found, once it had a shape she could understand and respond to directly, rather than the shapeless dread that had haunted her during those early weeks of discovery months before. Through it all, Daniel remained steady in a way that surprised even himself. He told Laura one evening, sitting together on the porch after the children had gone to bed, that he had spent so many years believing his old fear would always control him from the shadows, dictating every careful decision he made without her knowledge. Facing it directly now, even with new threats emerging along the way, felt different from the constant, low-grade dread he had carried silently for so long before she discovered the truth. "I used to think staying quiet was the same thing as staying strong," he admitted. "Now I understand it was actually the opposite. The strongest thing I've done through any of this wasn't hiding from Victor all those years ago. It was finally telling you everything, even knowing how much it might cost me." Laura leaned against his shoulder, watching the last light fade from the sky above their quiet street. "We're stronger doing this together than either of us would have been doing it alone," she said. "That's something I don't think either of us fully understood before all of this started." By the time the trial finally began, months after the letter and Cronin's subsequent arrest, Laura and Daniel walked into the courthouse each morning with a steadiness neither of them could have imagined possessing during those first frightening weeks after she discovered his phone turned face down on the kitchen counter. They had faced threats, both vague and specific, had rebuilt trust from the wreckage of years of secrecy, and had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that honesty between them, however difficult in the moment, was infinitely more sustainable than the careful architecture of silence Daniel had once believed necessary to protect the people he loved most. Years later, when their children were old enough to ask more detailed questions about the difficult period they vaguely remembered from childhood, Laura and Daniel answered them honestly, choosing age-appropriate truth over the kind of protective silence that had once nearly cost their family everything. Their daughter, particularly struck by her mother's determination during those early weeks of investigation, would later credit that story as part of what inspired her own decision to study criminal justice in college, wanting to help other families find their way through danger, the way Detective Okafor had helped hers. Laura kept, tucked away in a drawer she rarely opened, a single photograph from the day of Daniel's final testimony, the two of them standing on the courthouse steps in bright autumn sunlight, exhausted but unmistakably together. She looked at it occasionally, not out of any lingering fear, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how far they had traveled from that first uneasy morning when she noticed a phone turned face down and felt, for the first time, the smallest crack forming in a life she had once believed was built on nothing but simple, uncomplicated love. It had not been simple, she understood now, not for years before she even knew him, and not for the difficult months it took to finally bring everything into the light, but what they had built afterward, deliberately and honestly, brick by careful brick, was something stronger than the fragile, unknowing peace they had lived with before. It was a life built on truth, however hard-won, and Laura would not have traded that hard-earned honesty for the comfortable, uncertain ignorance of the years that came before it, not for anything in the world. Detective Okafor stayed in occasional contact with them even after the case fully closed, an unusual friendship that grew out of the trust built during those difficult months of investigation and trial. She would call sometimes, not for professional reasons anymore, simply to check in and see how the family was doing, and Laura came to value those calls as a quiet reminder that the frightening chapter of their lives had produced at least one lasting, unexpected good, a genuine friendship formed under the worst possible circumstances. Claire, too, remained a constant presence throughout the years that followed, though Laura noticed a subtle shift in how her sister spoke about trust and honesty within her own marriage, clearly influenced by everything she had witnessed Laura and Daniel work through together. It became, in its own quiet way, something the sisters discussed more openly than they ever had before, each of them learning from the other's experience how easily silence could take root in even the closest relationships if left unchallenged for too long. Daniel's relationship with their son deepened considerably during those years as well, particularly through his continued coaching of the soccer team, a commitment he maintained faithfully, even during the most stressful stretches of trial preparation. He told Laura once that standing on the sidelines each weekend watching their son run across an ordinary field on an ordinary afternoon reminded him more powerfully than anything else why he had fought so hard, in his own flawed and secretive way, to protect this particular version of an ordinary life all those years earlier. Laura's own career continued to grow steadily in the years following the trial, and she eventually found herself mentoring other women navigating difficult transitions in their own lives, drawing quietly on the resilience she had discovered in herself during those anxious weeks of investigation, without ever needing to share the specific details of what had shaped that resilience. She understood now that courage rarely announced itself in advance. It arrived quietly, in the decision to keep looking for the truth even when every instinct urged her to look away, and in the choice to face danger directly, rather than let fear make her decisions for her. On the 5th anniversary of the night Daniel finally told her everything, they sat together at the same kitchen table where that conversation had taken place, the surface worn now with years of homework sessions and family dinners layered on top of that single, difficult evening. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he had offered that first frightening night, though now it carried none of the fear that had colored it then. 5 years, he said quietly. I still think about how close we came to losing everything that night. But we didn't, Laura said. We built something better instead. Something honest. Outside, their children's voices drifted in from the backyard, ordinary and unremarkable. Exactly the kind of peaceful life Daniel had once believed he could only protect through careful, painful silence. Laura understood now, in a way she could not have fully articulated during those frightening early weeks of discovery, that real safety had never come from what they hid from each other. It had come, eventually and hard-won, from everything they finally chose to share.